8 months pregnant, Seraphina Vale was humiliated by her billionaire husband, who held a forged DNA report in his hand and declared the child wasn't his. Amidst the lavish crowd and blinding flashing lights, he ordered his guards to throw her out into the cold rain. No one stopped. No one spoke. Seraphina collapsed in the deserted street until a convoy of sleek black cars pulled up, and from them emerged the man whose name struck fear throughout the city. If you want to know the truth behind that night, like this post, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has progressed. And don't leave because it's only just beginning. The rain had been falling for 3 hours by the time Seraphina Vale understood that no one was coming for her. She stood beneath the stone archway of Black Ridge Estate's main entrance, and she could feel the cold working its way into her spine, pooling at the base of her back, where the ache had lived for the past 6 weeks. Her dress, ivory silk, chosen that morning because Declan had once said it made her look like someone worth fighting for, was already soaked through at the shoulders. The fabric clung to her stomach. 8 months. 8 months of carrying what she had believed, without a single doubt, was the thing that would finally anchor them. The cameras were still out there past the iron gate. She could see the white flare of flashbulbs through the tree line, could hear the low churn of voices. Journalists who'd been tipped off and arrived early, who had parked along the private road and waited with the practiced patience of people who understood that the best disasters announced themselves slowly. Someone had called them. She hadn't figured out who yet. She would, eventually, but not tonight. She pressed one hand flat against the stone pillar, just to steady herself, just to make sure the ground was still where it was supposed to be. Inside the ballroom, beyond the tall glass doors she was no longer permitted to open, Declan Ashford was still talking. She could hear the low register of his voice, that particular frequency he used when he needed a room to trust him, the kind of voice that belonged to boarding school debate teams and boardroom negotiations, and the sort of man who had never once, in 41 years of living, been told that he was wrong and had it stick. She'd loved that voice. She had actually loved it. That felt important to acknowledge, even now, because she didn't want to be the kind of woman who revised her own history to make the ending easier to carry. She'd been in the room when he started. She'd watched him unfold the paper. The document had been printed on laboratory letterhead. Harwick Diagnostics, the firm they'd both agreed on, the one she'd specifically requested because her own physician had recommended them. Declan had held it up with 2 hands, angled slightly toward the cluster of board members seated nearest the podium, and he'd read the results in a voice so calm it had taken her almost 4 full seconds to understand what was happening. The numbers, the markers, the conclusion typed in clean sans serif at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. She remembered the sound the room made, not gasps. Something more considered than that. The sound of people who had been waiting for permission to believe something they'd already privately decided. She remembered standing up. She remembered saying his name. She did not remember being escorted out, but she must have been, because here she was. Seraphina shifted her weight and pressed her palm harder into the stone until she could feel the grain of it against her lifeline. The baby moved, a slow, rolling pressure just beneath her ribs, the kind of movement that, until about 45 minutes ago, had made her exhale with something close to relief. Now it just made the ache sharper. She needed to call someone. She understood that with the same flat clarity she used to process logistics. You needed to call someone, the way you needed to drink water, or the way you needed to sit down before you fell down. The phone was in her coat pocket. Her coat was inside. The security guard who had walked her to the door, a young man with a forgettable face who had not once met her eyes, had not offered to retrieve it. She had her clutch. Inside the clutch, a hotel key card from a trip 3 months ago that she'd never cleaned out, $40 in cash, a lip balm, and her phone. She pulled the phone out. The screen cracked at one corner from the time she'd dropped it on the kitchen tile, and Declan had made the face he made when she was careless with things. She hadn't replaced it yet. She tried her attorney first. Marcus Webb, the number she'd had memorized for 2 years because Marcus had advised her early in the marriage that it was the kind of number worth memorizing. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She hung up without leaving a message because she didn't know what words to arrange in the time a voicemail allowed. She tried her friend Dara, straight to voicemail. She stood there for a moment looking at the phone screen, at the 11% battery indicator, at the time in the top corner which read 9:47 p.m., at the absence of any message from anyone, and she thought, this is what it looks like when it's been going on long enough that the exits are already sealed. She walked down the stone steps. The rain was immediate and total. She had about 30 feet of covered driveway before it became open road, and she covered that distance without looking back at the doors, without slowing down, without giving herself the option to reconsider. She made it to the gate, the pedestrian entrance, the small iron door beside the main vehicle gate, and she pushed it open and she walked through it, and the cameras found her in roughly 4 seconds. The shouting started before she'd taken 3 steps onto the road. "Mrs. Ashford, can you respond to tonight's announcement? Seraphina, is it true you refused a second paternity test? Statement from Ashford's publicist says you've been asked to vacate the family home by Friday." She kept walking. She didn't know where she was walking to. The estate was 7 miles from the nearest train station, and she had $40 and 11% battery, and whatever was happening in her lower back had graduated from ache to something with more insistence to it, something that was starting to time itself. She kept walking because stopping felt worse. Stopping felt like a concession to the idea that she was the kind of woman this happened to, and then she just stayed there, in the rain. While the cameras watched, the journalists followed for maybe half a mile before the rain discouraged them. After that, the road was empty. The streetlights were spaced far apart out here in the estate district, long dark stretches between each pool of yellow, and she moved from one pool to the next with her clutch held against her stomach and her wet dress dragging at her ankles. She thought about the DNA report. She was not a scientist. She was not a geneticist. But she had been present for every appointment at Harwick Diagnostics. Every appointment, including the sample collection, including the processing consultation, including the preliminary results walkthrough that the lab coordinator, a quiet woman named Dr. Anil Patel, had walked her through 3 weeks ago. And the number Dr. Patel had shown her was not 0. The number Dr. Patel had shown her was 99.97%, and Dr. Patel had handed her a printed copy, and Seraphina had folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat. Her coat, which was still inside Black Ridge Estate. She stopped walking. The contraction, she was using that word now inside her head because there was no longer any point in calling it something softer, moved through her lower abdomen in a long, controlled wave. She exhaled through it. She'd read the books. She knew what to do. She put one hand on her stomach and she breathed and she counted and she waited for it to pass. It passed. She started walking again. She got another quarter mile before her legs stopped cooperating. There was no drama to it. She simply became aware, somewhere between one step and the next, that her knees were not going to continue holding her weight, and she had just enough time to angle herself toward the low stone curb at the road's edge before she went down. She sat on the wet stone with her legs out in front of her and her hands braced behind her, and she stared at the dark road and thought about what options she actually had. She had $40. She had 4% battery now. She had a baby who was apparently planning to arrive ahead of schedule because that was consistent with how the last 8 months had gone. She had a husband who had just declared her a liar in front of 200 people. She had a copy of a DNA report that could prove him wrong, sitting in a coat pocket inside a building she was no longer allowed to enter. A car passed, then another. Neither slowed. She raised her hand. Reflex, not strategy. The car's headlights swept across her and then swept away, and she lowered her hand and looked at the phone. 2%. She called emergency services. The operator answered, and she gave her location as precisely as she could. The estate road, she said. The one that ran east off Caldwell Drive, approximately 1 mile past the main Black Ridge Gate. And the operator told her to stay on the line, and she said she couldn't because she had 2% battery, and the operator said they'd send someone, and she said thank you, and she hung up because she needed to keep 2%. The rain was lighter now, or she'd stopped feeling it. That was one of those things that was either reassuring or wasn't, depending on how you thought about it. The next contraction came 6 minutes after the first one. She breathed. She counted. She stared at the dark stretch of road and listened to the sound of water moving in the drainage ditch behind the stone curb. And she thought about her parents, about her mother's voice specifically, about a particular afternoon in the Vail Dynamics boardroom when she was 11 years old, and her mother had let her sit in the back corner while the quarterly review went on, and at one point her mother had caught her eye across the room and simply nodded, the way you nod at someone who belongs somewhere. And she had understood that the nod was a kind of inheritance, the most unconditional kind, the kind that couldn't be contested or forged or walked into a ballroom and publicly revoked. She closed her eyes. When the headlights swept over her this time, they were different. She registered that before she understood why. Multiple light sources, positioned high, the kind of height that belonged to vehicles with serious suspension. She opened her eyes. 4 vehicles. Black. All of them. With a consistency that wasn't accidental. The kind of vehicles that didn't exist in fleets unless someone had made a deliberate decision about what message a fleet should send. They moved slowly. Not the deceleration of someone spotting an obstacle, but the deliberate pace of vehicles that had already decided to stop. They pulled up parallel to where she sat on the curb, and the lead vehicle stopped with its front bumper perhaps 8 feet from her, and the engine quieted, and for a moment nothing happened. The rear door of the lead vehicle opened. The man who stepped out was not what she would have expected if she'd been in a condition to have expectations. He was not tall in a way that announced itself. He wore a dark coat, good fabric, the kind of cut that didn't come from a catalog, and he moved across the wet asphalt with the specific economy of someone who had never once needed to demonstrate that he was capable of damage, because anyone who mattered already knew. He stopped about 6 feet from her. He looked at her. Not at her stomach, not at her dress, not at the obvious disaster of her situation. At her face. Like he was reading something there and taking his time about it. "Can you stand?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Even. The kind of voice that didn't need to work to fill a space. She thought about lying. She thought about saying yes. She was fine. She was waiting for someone. Everything was under control. She looked at him for a moment and she said, "I don't think so." He nodded once, like that was the answer he'd expected, like it was information he could use. He turned slightly and said something she didn't catch, low, directed at the vehicle, and 2 men came forward immediately, not rushing, but fast. And she felt hands, careful and impersonal, at her arms and at her back. And she was being lifted, and she wanted to protest, and she opened her mouth, and the third contraction hit, and the protest dissolved into a sound she hadn't planned to make, something involuntary and unguarded, and the last thing she was clearly aware of before the dark took the edges off. Everything was the man in the dark coat watching her with that same steady, unreadable expression, and the thought that surfaced, strange, irrational, the kind of thought that only arrives in extremis, was that he looked like someone who had never once been surprised by the worst thing that could happen. She lost consciousness before the car door closed. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what she'd walked into, or what it would cost her, or whether the hands that caught her were safer than the ones that had thrown her out. She didn't know that in the vehicle behind her, one of his men had already photographed the entrance to Blackridge Estate, had already run the address against 3 different databases, had already sent the results to an encrypted server she would never have clearance to access. She didn't know any of that. What she knew, or what some part of her knew, the part that didn't require consciousness to operate, was that the rain had stopped, and someone had decided she was worth stopping for. She came back in pieces. First the sound, a low mechanical hum that she couldn't place, something ventilation adjacent, the kind of white noise that existed specifically to remind you that you were in a controlled environment. Then the light, pale and clinical behind her eyelids, not the blue-white of a hospital, but something warmer, more deliberate, like someone had made a choice about what kind of light a person should wake up to. Then the weight, the familiar specific weight of her stomach, which was still there, which meant the contractions had either stopped or she'd been sedated, and the fear that came with not knowing which one of those was true arrived before she'd fully opened her eyes. She opened her eyes. The ceiling was white, not institutional white, the white of a room that cost money, crown molding, a single recessed fixture, the kind of clean that required staff to maintain. She turned her head. An IV line ran from the back of her left hand to a stand beside the bed. A monitor sat on a rolling cart to her right, and the readout on it showed 2 lines. Her heart rate, she identified, and something slower, something with a different rhythm. And it took her 3 seconds to understand that the second line was the baby. A woman in a gray uniform, not scrubs, a gray dress with a small emblem on the breast pocket that Seraphina couldn't read from this angle, was seated near the door with a tablet, and when she saw Seraphina's eyes open, she stood and said, "I'll get the doctor," and left before Seraphina could form a response. Seraphina looked at the monitor. Both lines were steady. She exhaled. The doctor who came in was a compact man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular manner of physicians who had spent careers working in environments where discretion was not optional. Something in the way he moved, economical, unshowable, like he'd learned a long time ago that bedside manner was a liability in certain contexts. He introduced himself as Dr. Farouk. He told her the contractions had been Braxton Hicks, not labor, triggered by dehydration and physical stress. He told her the baby's vitals were strong. He told her she needed 48 hours of rest, monitored fluids, and to avoid stress. She looked at him and said, "Where am I?" He said, "Somewhere safe," and checked the IV line. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He made a note on his tablet and said, "Someone will come speak with you shortly. Rest if you can." He left. She lay there for a while looking at the ceiling and doing the arithmetic of her situation. She was in a building she didn't know, connected to monitoring equipment, with no phone. She checked, her clutch was not on the bedside table, and no identification beyond whatever was in the dress she was still wearing, which had been covered with a thin blanket someone had tucked to her chin with more care than she expected. The door was closed, but she didn't think it was locked. She didn't think she was a prisoner. She thought that was probably a distinction she should be careful about assuming. The door opened without a knock. Lucien Moretti didn't enter a room so much as he renegotiated its geometry. He was the same man from the road. Same coat, same unhurried movement. And he carried 2 cups of something hot, one of which he set on the cart beside her monitor without asking whether she wanted it. He took the chair the gray uniformed woman had vacated, pulled it slightly closer to the bed, and sat down. He set his own cup on his knee and looked at her. "How are you feeling?" he said. Not a question, exactly. More like an opening position. "You didn't lock the door," she said. "No. But you took my phone." "Your phone is charging. You had 1% when we found you." He reached into his coat pocket and set it on the cart beside the cup. The screen showed 42%. The crack in the corner was the same. She looked at the phone. She looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, more like recognition, like she'd asked the version of the question he'd expected rather than the one people usually asked, which was probably some variation of "Don't you know who I am?" "Lucien Moretti," he said. The name landed. She'd heard it. Everyone in this city had heard it, in the same way you heard about weather systems and infrastructure failures. Not because you sought out the information, but because it was the kind of information that moved through social environments on its own, accumulating detail the way a rumor accumulates detail, until what you had was less a biography than a composite of other people's fear. Lucien Moretti. The name attached to 3 legitimate holding companies and a number of other interests that legitimate vocabulary didn't cover. The name that certain people said carefully and other people didn't say at all. She said, "Why did you stop?" He looked at her for a moment. "You were on the road. People don't stop for things that are on the road." "Some people don't," he said. It wasn't an answer. She was beginning to understand that with him, the gap between what was said and what was meant was going to require constant navigation. She filed that away and said, "I need to leave." "You need 48 hours of monitored rest. Dr. Farouk is competent. The equipment is current." "My attorney..." "Marcus Webb. He's aware you're safe. He doesn't know where you are." The precision of that stopped her. She studied his face and said, "You called my attorney. We found his number in your recent calls. And you told him I was safe." "Yes." "But not where." "No." She let that sit. "Why not?" "Because I don't know yet who else your attorney talks to," he said. "And until I do, location is information I'd rather manage." She felt the particular cold of that. Not threat, but control. the kind of control that was so practiced it didn't need to announce itself. She said, "You think this is bigger than my husband lying about a paternity test?" He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the road, like he was reading something and taking his time. "I think," he said, "that the laboratory that produced that report has an irregular relationship with 3 entities that also have a relationship with Veil Dynamics. I think that's an interesting coincidence." The room felt smaller suddenly. She said, "How do you know about Veil Dynamics?" "You're Seraphina Veil," he said. "Your parents founded a $9 billion technology company. You inherited controlling interest when they died. You married Declan Ashford 14 months ago." He paused. "Your husband sits on the board of 2 firms that have been quietly acquiring Veil Dynamics shares through shell structures for the past 8 months. 8 months. The length of her pregnancy. She looked at the monitor, both lines steady. She said, "Show me." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out, and she took it and unfolded it, and it was a corporate filing, but she recognized the format. She'd grown up watching her mother review documents like this. And the entity names meant nothing to her, but the ownership chains were clear enough if you knew what to follow. And she followed them. And she felt something cold and specific settle into her chest that was different from fear. Colder than fear. More useful. "Victor Soren," she said. The name was at the end of one of the chains. Declan's financial advisor. The man who had been present at every significant meeting of their marriage, who had a habit of arriving early and leaving last, who had once told her at a dinner party that her parents had been visionaries, but that vision without execution was just imagination. "Victor Soren," Lucian confirmed. She refolded the document and held it in both hands and stared at the blank wall above the door and said, very quietly, "They used the pregnancy. The whole scandal. They needed me out of the company before the shareholders' summit." "The summit is in 6 weeks," he said. "If you're removed from the chairmanship for cause, personal misconduct, adultery, instability, the board has grounds to vote on succession without your participation. Ashford's allies have enough votes to push through a restructuring that would effectively transfer controlling interest within 30 days of the summit. And if I'm not there to contest it, then it's done." She sat with that. She looked at the corporate filing in her hands. She thought about Declan at the podium with his carefully printed document and his calibrated voice and the way the board members had looked at each other, not surprised, just confirming. She thought about how long it takes to build something like that, the patience of it, the architecture, all those weeks of her own marriage being used as construction material. She said, "The DNA report was altered." "Yes, you know this. My people accessed the laboratory's internal records this evening. There are 2 versions of your results in their system. The original, processed 3 weeks ago, shows Ashford as the biological father with a probability of 99.97%. The version submitted for tonight's presentation was altered at the file level approximately 9 days ago. The alteration was done by someone with internal system access." He paused. "We're identifying them." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question she'd been holding back since he sat down, the one that mattered more than any of the logistics, because the logistics were recoverable if the premise was sound. The premise was, this man had no obvious reason to help her. Men like Lucien Moretti didn't stop on rain-soaked roads out of generosity. There was always a geometry to it, always a return. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Your father and I had a business arrangement a long time ago. He was one of the few men I've dealt with who never needed to be reminded what honesty cost." She held his gaze. "That's a partial answer." "Yes," he said. "It is." She decided to accept that for now, not because she trusted it, but because she understood that trust was a currency you spent carefully when you had nothing else, and she needed to keep what she had. She said, "I want to see the original DNA report. I'll have it tonight. I want my phone back." He nodded at the cart where he'd placed it. "And I want to know," she said, "everything your people find, not summaries, everything." He studied her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone more frightened." She said, "I'm frightened. I'm just not going to let it run the meeting." Something shifted in him then. Slight, almost imperceptible, but she caught it, a small recalibration. He stood, buttoning his coat. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." He left. The door didn't lock. She picked up her phone and looked at it. Then she set it back down and reached for the cup he'd left. And it was tea, plain, no sugar, the temperature of something that had been prepared by someone who knew she probably wasn't going to be able to sleep anyway. She drank it and stared at the monitor and thought about veil dynamics, and about her mother's nod across a boardroom, and about the fact that somewhere in this building, a man she didn't know was pulling the architecture of her destruction apart, brick by brick, for reasons he hadn't fully explained. She didn't sleep, but she planned. By 3 a.m, she had filled 6 pages of a legal pad that the gray-uniformed woman had brought without being asked. Timeline, names, gaps in the timeline, questions about the gaps. And by 4, she had identified 3 things she could do independently, without Lucian's network, that didn't require her to be anywhere but this room. She called Marcus Webb at 4:18 a.m. He answered on the second ring, which told her he hadn't slept either. "Marcus," she said. "Sarah." His voice was tight. "Are you?" "I'm okay. The baby's okay. Listen to me." She looked at the legal pad. "I need you to file an emergency injunction to halt any shareholder proceedings related to Veil Dynamics board succession. I need it filed before the market opens." Silence. Then, "On what grounds?" "Fraud. Evidence tampering. Corporate conspiracy." She paused. "I also need you to subpoena the internal records from Harwick Diagnostics. Full system access, all versions of all files processed in the past 30 days. Another silence, longer. "Sarah, if this goes sideways..." "It's already sideways, Marcus. We're just deciding which direction to fall." He exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I'll have documentation to you by 7 a.m. She hung up. She looked at the legal pad. She thought about Declan sleeping in the Blackridge master bedroom, probably in the crisp linen sheets that the housekeeper pressed every Tuesday, probably with the particular sleep of a man who had done something difficult and done it well, the sleep of completion. She thought about Victor Soren, wherever he was, running his numbers, satisfied. She thought about 6 weeks. At 6:45 a.m., a knock at her door. Not Lucien. One of his men, broad, quiet, the kind of quiet that was professional rather than shy, who handed her a sealed folder without a word. Inside, a printed copy of her original DNA, results from Harwick Diagnostics, time-stamped, with a chain of custody notation she didn't recognize but which she suspected would mean something to a forensic analyst. And beneath it, a second document. A financial transfer record showing a wire of $340,000 from an account registered to one of Victor Soren's shell entities, sent to a personal account belonging to a Harwick Diagnostic Systems technician named Carl Weber, processed 8 days ago. She sat with these documents for a long time. Then she photographed each page with her phone and sent them to Marcus Webb. Her phone rang 40 seconds later. "Where did you get these?" Marcus said. His voice had changed. The tightness was still there, but underneath it was something else, the specific register of an attorney who has just seen the case shift. "Does it matter?" "It might, in terms of admissibility." "Then find a way to make it matter in the right direction," she said. "Can you use them?" A pause. "I can use them as the basis for a formal discovery request that would compel the lab to produce their own internal records, which they would have to do, which would then be court-obtained." Another pause. "Yes, I can use them." "Good." She looked at the monitor, both lines steady. "File the injunction, Marcus." She ended the call and set the phone on the cart and looked at the wall, and then the door opened again, and this time it was Lucien. Without the tea, without any preliminary, and his expression was the same as always, unreadable, economic, except that there was something beneath it now, something with edges. He said, "Carl Weber is dead." She heard the words. She processed them with a strange, dissociated calm, the same calm that had gotten her off the estate road and through the rain, the kind of calm that wasn't peace but its functional substitute. "When?" she said. "His body was found 40 minutes ago. Apparent accident. Vehicle collision on the interstate. No other cars involved." He paused. He was the technician who altered your file. She looked at him. They're cleaning up. Yes. Which means they know you found him. Or they were always going to clean up. Insurance. His jaw moved slightly. Either way, our direct evidence chain now has a gap where its most critical witness was. She sat with that. She thought about the $340,000 wire transfer sitting on her phone, sitting in Marcus Webb's inbox. She thought about a man named Carl Weber who had made a decision 8 days ago that had led to this, and whether he'd understood what kind of people he was taking money from, and whether understanding it would have changed anything. Probably not. That was the thing about people like Victor Soren. They were very good at making sure that by the time you understood the full shape of what you'd agreed to, exit was no longer an option. She said, the transfer record, the wire from Soren's entity to Weber's account. It establishes motive and connection, Lucian said, but without Weber's testimony, it doesn't establish the act itself. A good defense attorney dismantles it in an afternoon. So we need the surveillance. He looked at her. What surveillance? The laboratory. They have internal surveillance on the server room, on all archive access terminals. Dr. Patel told me, she mentioned it during our consultation, said all record access was logged and monitored after a data breach 2 years ago. She held his gaze. If someone accessed and altered my file from inside the building, they were on camera doing it. The silence that followed was different from his other silences. This one had weight to it, the weight of something being reassessed. The surveillance archive would be on a separate server from the patient records, he said. Not a question. Presumably. Which means whoever altered the file may not have known to scrub it, or didn't have access to do so. She paused. Can your people get in? He looked at her for a moment with that same steady, measuring attention, and she had the sense that she was being filed under a category that hadn't existed before tonight, and she was not entirely comfortable with that, but she was also past the point where comfort was a variable worth optimizing. Yes, he said, they can. She nodded. She picked up the legal pad. She said, then we have 24 hours before whoever just arranged a traffic accident realizes that Carl Weber dying doesn't actually close the file. And after 24 hours? She looked at him. After 24 hours, they come for the next thing that can hurt them. She let that land. Which is me. Lucien didn't argue with that. He stood there in the doorway of her borrowed room in his building she didn't have a name for, in a city that had thrown her out into the rain 12 hours ago, and he said, then we move faster than they do. Yes, she said, we do. Outside, somewhere in the city, a financial advisor named Victor Soren was waking up to news that his loose end had been tied, and he did not yet know that the woman he'd tried to erase was sitting upright in a hospital bed with a legal pad full of his name, or that the man who'd found her was already sending people back into the laboratory he thought he'd neutralized. He did not yet know that the loose end had, in the dark and the rain, found something that held. But he was about to start. The surveillance footage arrived at 11:14 a.m. Lucien's man, the broad, quiet one whose name she still didn't know and hadn't asked, brought a laptop into her room and set it on the cart beside the monitor without ceremony, angled the screen toward her and left. The file was already open. Timestamp in the top corner. Harwick Diagnostics, Server Room B, 9 days ago, 11:47 p.m. The footage was grayscale, fixed angle, the kind of institutional camera that existed to create legal cover rather than to actually catch anything, so the resolution was poor and the lighting was worse. But it was enough. A figure in a technician's badge and dark clothing moved through the server room door using a keycard, sat at the archive terminal, and worked for 11 minutes and 33 seconds. At 11:58 p.m., the figure stood, removed something small from the terminal, a drive, she thought, portable, thumb-sized, and left. The face was partially obscured, cap pulled low. But the badge was readable if you paused at the right frame, and she paused it, and the name on the badge was Carl Weber. And she stared at it for a long time with her legal pad on her knee and a pen she'd been holding so long the imprint had moved from her fingers to somewhere deeper. She took screenshots. She sent them to Marcus. Marcus called back in 4 minutes. The badge confirms Weber's access, he said. Combined with the transfer record, this is circumstantial, but it's layered, enough to compel a full forensic audit of the lab's systems if we get in front of the right judge. How fast? I filed the injunction at 7. I'm waiting on a hearing assignment. If we get Judge Calloway, possibly this afternoon. If we get Reinhardt... He stopped. If we get Reinhardt has a relationship with 2 of the firms on that ownership chain you sent me. I looked it up this morning. She said nothing for a moment. She looked at the laptop screen, at the frozen grayscale image of a dead man's badge in a server room. Is there a way to request assignment? Not formally, but I can file a motion for expedited hearing that might push it toward Calloway's docket based on the medical circumstances. A pause. Using your pregnancy. Use it. Seraphina. Marcus. Use it. He exhaled. All right. She ended the call and sat back against the headboard and looked at the ceiling and thought about the geometry of what was being built. Evidence chain from financial transfer to lab access to altered file. Injunction to freeze board proceedings. Forensic audit to produce court-certified copies of the original DNA results. Clean, sequential, the kind of case that assembled itself in a straight line if nothing went wrong. She thought about Carl Weber's car on the interstate. No other vehicles involved. She thought about how many other straight lines this operation had already bent. At 2 in the afternoon, Lucien came back. He didn't sit this time. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides and his coat over one arm, and he said, "The injunction was assigned to Judge Reinhardt." She looked at him. "The motion for expedited hearing was denied," he said. "Reinhardt ruled insufficient grounds." She held the pen. She held it until she could feel her own pulse in her hand. Then she set it on the legal pad very carefully and said, "He's bought. Or managed. The distinction matters legally." He paused. "It doesn't change the outcome." Which is? The next scheduled docket date for the injunction hearing is in 8 weeks. He watched her process that. The shareholders' summit is in 6. The arithmetic was immediate and total. 6 weeks to the summit. 8 weeks to a hearing, meaning the injunction didn't exist in any practical sense, meaning the board proceedings moved forward unimpeded, meaning Declan and Victor Soren had 6 weeks to complete what they'd started, and she had no legal mechanism left that could stop it in time. She said, "The forensic audit request." Denied pending the injunction hearing. She said, "The original DNA results." Not court certified. Inadmissible without the audit. She was quiet. The monitor beside her kept its steady double rhythm, her pulse and the baby's, patient and indifferent to the way everything had just restructured itself around her. She said, "They knew. About Reinhardt." "Yes." "They filed Reinhardt in before we started. Before I even..." She stopped, recalibrated. "They had a judge in place before the summit, before the ballroom. This wasn't contingency. This was the plan." Lucien said nothing. His face said nothing. But she'd been watching him long enough now to read the quality of his silences, and this one had the particular texture of a man who had already known something and had been waiting for her to arrive at it herself. "How long have you been tracking this?" she said. He looked at her. "Lucien." She said his name for the first time, and it changed the room slightly, the way a temperature change changes a room. "How long?" 4 months, he said. The word sat there. She said, 4 months. Veil dynamics appeared in a financial pattern I was already monitoring. Shell entities moving capital in a way that indicated a coordinated acquisition strategy. My analysts flagged it. He paused. "At that point, your name was attached to the company as chairwoman. Your husband's name appeared in the Shell ownership chains." 4 months ago, she said, "I was 5 months pregnant." "Yes." "And you didn't..." She stopped herself. The anger that rose was clean and total, and she let herself feel the shape of it before she made a decision about what to do with it. "You knew my husband was building a case against me. You knew this was coming." "I knew a corporate acquisition scheme was in progress. I didn't know they were going to use your pregnancy to manufacture a personal scandal." A pause that felt considered. "I didn't know about the DNA report until the night I found you." "But you knew something." "Yes." And you watched. I was investigating. While they were building the structure that would take everything my parents... She stopped again. Breathed. The baby moved, a long, slow shift that pulled her attention for just a moment, grounding her in the specific physical reality of what was at stake. And she used that moment to put the anger somewhere it could wait. Would it have changed anything, she said, if you'd come to me 4 months ago? He held her gaze. Possibly not. Without the evidence chain, any warning I gave you was hearsay from a source your husband's attorneys would have made immediately inadmissible. Possibly not, she repeated. No, he said. Probably not. She looked at the legal pad. 6 pages of notes that had, in the past 40 minutes, reorganized themselves from a plan into a map of a plan that no longer worked. She thought about Marcus Webb, who was probably sitting in his office right now, looking at the same restructured geometry and arriving at the same conclusions. Her phone rang. Marcus. She answered it and put it on speaker and said, I know. Reinhardt is dirty, Marcus said. He sounded tired. The particular tired of someone who had not slept and had just had a door close in his face. I've been making calls, quietly. The 2 firms on the ownership chain that I flagged, Reinhardt has been on their legal advisory board under a consultancy arrangement. It's structured to be technically legal, but the conflict is, Marcus, what can we do about it? A long pause. A judicial recusal motion, but that takes time and it requires documenting the conflict formally, which requires discovery, which we can't compel without the injunction. Yes. The circularity of it was almost elegant. You couldn't challenge the judge without discovery. You couldn't compel discovery without the injunction. You couldn't advance the injunction without the judge. Victor Soren had built a closed loop, and he'd built it with enough lead time that she hadn't known the loop existed until she was already inside it. She said, what about going over his head? Appeals court could hear an emergency recusal petition, but we'd need documented evidence of the conflict, not just the advisory board relationship, which is publicly registered and technically disclosed. We'd need proof of communication, direction, a financial arrangement specific to this case. Can we get that? The silence stretched. Not through legal channels in 6 weeks. She looked at Lucien. He'd been listening with his arms still at his sides, his coat still folded over one arm, with the expression of a man auditing something. Now he met her eyes and gave a slight, single nod. Not agreement, more like acknowledgement, like he understood what she was about to say and was waiting to confirm it. She said, Marcus, keep building the formal record, everything documented, everything filed correctly. I need a clean legal trail even if it moves slowly. What are you going to do? What I need to do. She hung up. She looked at Lucien. She said, Reinhardt. I heard. You have people who can find proof of direct communication between him and Soren, or between him and anyone in this structure. Yes. How fast? 48 hours, possibly less. And if you find it, he said, that depends on how you want to use it. He held her gaze. Legally, evidence obtained outside the formal discovery process has admissibility problems. You'd need a separate chain of custody. I know that. But evidence that exists is leverage. It doesn't have to be submitted to be applied. She understood what he was saying. She sat with it. This was the thing she'd been approaching since 6:45 this morning, since the folder with the wire transfer record, since the conversation that had arrived at your people can get in. This was the line. Not crossed yet, but close enough that she could see what was on the other side of it, and what was on the other side of it was Lucien Moretti's methodology applied to her problem. And she was sitting in his facility, in his debt, and she had 6 weeks and the legal system had just closed itself around her like a fist. She said, find it, all of it, every communication, every financial arrangement, every connection between Reinhardt and Soren and Declan and anyone else in this structure. She paused. I'll decide what to do with it when I see what it is. He nodded. He moved to leave. She said, Lucien. He stopped. The night on the road, she said. You said you'd looked into the laboratory records the same evening. Your people were already moving before I woke up. He turned. He waited. You said you were monitoring the Veil Dynamics situation for 4 months, and then you happened to be on that specific road that night. She held his gaze. Were you following me? The silence this time was different from all the others. It had a specific weight, a specific texture, the texture of something true being considered for presentation. I knew the event at Blackridge was scheduled, he said. I knew what Ashford was planning to present. I positioned myself nearby because I anticipated you would need assistance afterward. A pause. I didn't know the extent of what they do. I didn't know they'd put you out in the rain. But you were there. Yes, she absorbed that. That's not the same as coincidence. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things this admission opened, questions about his motives, about the debt she'd been accumulating since the rain, about the exact nature of a man who positioned himself near disasters that hadn't fully happened yet. She didn't ask them, not because she didn't want the answers, but because she understood that some questions, asked too early, produced answers you couldn't work with yet. She said, "Thank you for being there." He looked slightly unsettled by that, by the plain directness of it. He said, "Rest," and left. She picked up the legal pad. She drew a line through 3 items that were no longer viable. She stared at what remained. Then she turned to a clean page and she started over, this time with different premises, different tools, and the specific cold focus of a woman who had just understood that the version of herself who trusted institutions to correct injustice was not going to survive the next 6 weeks. The new version was still forming. She could feel it assembling, quiet and necessary, in the space between what she'd been and what the situation required. She didn't love it, but she recognized it. The next 36 hours moved in short, compressed intervals. Dr. Farouk came twice, checked the monitor, told her the baby was stable, told her she needed to remain calm, and she thanked him with the politeness of someone who had cataloged calm as a resource to be managed rather than a state to be achieved. The gray uniformed woman brought food she ate because the baby needed her to, not because she tasted it. Marcus Webb called 4 times, and she spoke to him in the clipped, precise language of someone building a structure under time pressure, every word load-bearing. On the second morning, Lucien's quiet man brought her another folder. Inside, 47 pages. Phone records. Encrypted message transcripts, partially decoded. 3 wire transfer records from an account registered to Reinhardt's consultancy to a numbered account that traced, through 4 intermediary steps, to a holding entity that also appeared in the Veil Dynamics acquisition chain. A photograph, grainy, taken at distance, of Reinhardt and Victor Soren at a restaurant table that, based on the metadata embedded in the file, was from 11 weeks ago, and a name she didn't expect. She read it twice. She turned the page over as if there might be a correction on the back. She turned it face up again and read the name a 3rd time, and sat very still while the monitor kept its rhythm and the building hummed its white noise hum, and the things she'd understood about her situation restructured itself completely, the way a building restructures when you remove a wall you thought was decorative and find out it was load-bearing. The name was Marcus Webb. 3 of the wire transfers had a corresponding account that traced to a shell entity with a registered agent that was also the registered agent for Marcus Webb's holding company, the LLC, under which he maintained his private investment portfolio, the one she'd known existed in a peripheral, unexamined way, because attorneys had these structures, and she'd never had reason to look at it directly. $700,000, moved in 3 tranches over 4 months. She sat there for a very long time. She thought about Marcus's voice when she'd called him at 4:18 in the morning. "Are you?" he'd said. "Sarah." The particular relief in it. She'd read it as a friend relieved she was alive. She turned it over now in the new light, and she read it differently, and the rereading was the kind of thing that, once done, could not be undone. She thought about every conversation, every piece of strategy she'd shared, the forensic audit request he'd filed in a way that gave Reinhardt a clean legal basis to deny it. The injunction language she'd approved, filed the moment the markets opened, giving Soren's team maximum preparation time before the hearing. She thought about the 4 times he'd called in 36 hours, and what information had moved in each of those calls. and where that information had gone afterward. She picked up her phone. She looked at Marcus Webb's number in her contacts. She thought about calling him. She thought about what she would say and what he would say, and whether there was a version of the conversation that produced something useful. She thought about all the strategies she had already given him, all the documents she'd already sent, all the positions she'd already disclosed. She set the phone down. She pressed the call button on the bedside panel, and the gray uniformed woman appeared in under a minute, and she said, "I need to speak with Lucien. Now." He came in 8 minutes. He looked at her, and then he looked at the folder open on her lap, and she watched his face, and his face told her that he'd already read the 47 pages, that the name had not surprised him, that he had chosen to give her the information and let her arrive at it without preparation. She said, "You knew." "I suspected," he said. "The account linkage was confirmed 3 hours ago." 3 hours. "I wanted to verify before—" "How much," she said, "does he know?" Lucien sat down. This time, for the first time, he sat down like a man carrying weight. "Everything you've told him since the morning after the ballroom, every document you sent, the full injunction strategy, the surveillance footage, the wire transfer record, the forensic audit request." He paused. "He knows what evidence you have and what you plan to do with it." She said, "So Soren knows?" "Yes." "And Declan?" "Yes." "And the photograph from the laboratory surveillance, Weber's access log?" "They know you have it." She looked at the wall. She thought about the specific shape of her position, evidence that couldn't be certified without a judge who was bought, an attorney who had been feeding her strategy to the other side, a witness who was dead, and a shareholders' summit in 6 weeks that would transfer her parents' company to people who had built their acquisition plan inside the architecture of her own marriage. She thought about the version of herself that had believed in straight lines. She said, very quietly, "What do I have that they don't know about?" Lucien looked at her. His expression had shifted. Not much, but enough. The calculation in it was still there, but there was something else now, something that was either respect or its immediate precursor. "They don't know," he said slowly, "about the restaurant photograph. We recovered that through a channel that isn't connected to anything Webb had access to." He paused. "And they don't know what I'm willing to do." She looked at him. "They built this operation assuming you were alone," he said. "They built it assuming that anyone with the capability to oppose them was either purchased or neutralized. They didn't account for a variable they didn't know existed. You. The full extent of what I can access." He held her gaze. "They know my name. They don't know my reach." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the 47 pages. She looked at the photograph of 2 men at a table, 11 weeks ago, deciding the shape of her future without her present. She said, "Then we start over. Everything we've built through Marcus we assume is compromised. Every strategy we've discussed in a way that could have been transmitted, we discard." She paused. "We build from what they can't see." "Yes." "And Marcus?" Lucien waited. "He doesn't know that we know," she said. "That's a door, if we use it right." She looked at the legal pad. "We can feed him something. Something that looks like our real strategy, but isn't. Something that makes them commit to a counter move that we're already positioned." They gave Marcus Webb something real enough to taste. Seraphina wrote it herself. 4 pages, drafted on the legal pad in handwriting that was tighter than usual because she was being precise about every word, every implied strategy, every piece of bait that needed to look like her actual thinking without being it. She told him the surveillance footage had been corrupted, technically unrecoverable. She told him the wire transfer record had a chain of custody problem that made it legally unusable. She told him she was preparing to approach the board directly, individually, to negotiate a settlement that preserved her chairmanship in exchange for a quiet withdrawal of the paternity challenge. She told him the shareholders' summit was not going to be the venue. Too public, too risky. She sent it to him in a voice memo at 9 p.m. using the exhausted, slightly fractured voice of a woman who had run out of better options. She even let her breath catch once near the end. That part wasn't entirely performance. Marcus called back in 11 minutes. He said he thought that was wise. He said he thought a board negotiation was the right move. He said he'd been worried about the summit approach. Too exposed. Too much could go wrong. He said all of this in the warm, careful voice of a man who had spent 20 years being paid to sound like someone's advocate. And she listened to every word and made notes. And when she hung up, she sat in the dark for a while before she turned the lamp back on. Lucien had been standing in the doorway. He'd been there for most of the call, just outside the frame of it, arms at his sides. She said, "He'll pass it within the hour." "Yes." So they pull back from whatever they had positioned for the summit. They redirect toward the board negotiation play, which doesn't exist, which means they're preparing for a fight that isn't coming. She looked at the lamp. "And the summit is ours. If everything else holds. What's left to hold?" He moved into the room. He sat in the chair, which by now had become his chair in this room, and he said, "The hospital records. The original DNA results on file with Dr. Patel. We need a certified copy that exists through a clean legal channel, not through my network. Something that can be presented in a public forum without provenience questions." "Dr. Patel," Seraphina said. "She's the one who showed me the original results. She knows what she processed. She could produce a certified copy directly from the treating physician's file. That's a different record from the laboratory archive. Patient medical record, not lab record. Different chain." Lucien was very still. "Would she?" "I don't know. I haven't spoken to her since before the ballroom." She paused. "Carl Weber is dead. She might be frightened. She has reason to be. Or she has reason to be angry." She looked at him. "People who do clean work don't love finding out someone used their systems to destroy someone's life. If she knows what Weber did," "She knows," Lucien said, "it would have been investigated internally once his death made the news. She knows her system was compromised. Then I want to talk to her." He looked at her for a moment. She'd be coming into proximity with this situation. That carries risk. "I'm not asking you to threaten her," she said, with an edge she didn't bother to blunt. "I'm asking you to get me in a room with her where I can ask her to do the right thing." He nodded once. "Tomorrow morning." Doctor. Anil Patel was a small woman in her mid-40s who wore her hair in a low knot and had the particular quality of someone who had arrived at composure through difficulty rather than temperament. She came to the facility, one of Lucien's properties, clean and neutral and nothing like what she'd probably imagined. And she sat across from Seraphina in a room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked out on a courtyard, and she folded her hands on the table and she said, before Seraphina could begin, "I know why you called me." Seraphina said, "Then you know what I need. You need my patient file copy of your original results." She looked at Seraphina's stomach. "When are you due?" 4 weeks. Patel was quiet for a moment. "I've been in that building for 11 years, she said. "I've processed close to 40,000 samples. I have never—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Someone used a key card they shouldn't have had access to and sat at a terminal in my server room for 12 minutes and turned accurate science into a weapon." She looked at her folded hands. "Carl Weber worked for me for 3 years. I supervised his certification." Seraphina said, "I'm sorry." He made a choice. Patel's voice was flat. "I'm not here to grieve his choices." She looked up. "The patient file copy exists in our clinical record system, which is administered separately from the laboratory archive. Different server, different access protocols, different administrative chain. It wasn't touched." She paused. "I can produce a certified copy through the treating physician's channel. It's fully within my authority as the processing clinician. No court order required." Seraphina felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the structural precursor to it, the sense of a load-bearing piece clicking into place. She said, "Would you testify?" Patel looked at her for a long moment. "To what?" "To the existence of 2 versions of the results, to the integrity of the clinical record, to the process by which the original was produced and what it showed." "In what venue?" "The Vail Dynamics Shareholders Summit, in front of the board, the investors, and whatever press is in attendance." She held Patel's gaze. "On the record. In public. With cameras." Patel was quiet for long enough that Seraphina counted her own heartbeats, 12 of them before Patel said, "Yes." The word was small and absolute. Seraphina nodded. That was all. The next 4 weeks were the most precisely controlled chaos she had ever managed. On the surface, Marcus Webb continued to believe he was advising a woman in strategic retreat. She fed him 3 more pieces of misdirection, each one calibrated to produce a specific response. A board contact she wanted them to misprepare for. A legal position she wanted them to overinvest in. A timeline she wanted them to trust. She hated the tactical fluency with which she did this. She was good at it, which was its own unsettling discovery. Underneath the surface, Lucien's network was building what they would actually need. The restaurant photograph of Reinhardt and Soren was traced to its source. A private security firm had been running surveillance on the adjacent property for an unrelated matter and had captured the meeting in the periphery of their footage. The firm's records were obtained through a legitimate licensing arrangement that Lucien's legal team structured in 72 hours. Provenance clean. Admissible. The 3 wire transfers to Reinhardt's consultancy were cross-referenced against public court records and produced a pattern. 7 cases in the past 4 years where Reinhardt had ruled in ways that benefited entities connected to Soren's network. A statistical brief was prepared by 2 forensic accountants whose methodology would survive peer review. Clean. Documented. The kind of evidence that didn't need to be submitted to a court to end a man's career in public. And Seraphina healed, or her body did the thing bodies do when given reasonable conditions. The baby turned, the contractions stayed Braxton Hicks, the monitors showed clean lines. She slept badly and thought constantly, and walked the corridor of Lucien's facility in the early mornings because lying still had stopped being possible. She built the summit presentation on her laptop in pieces, every piece sourced, every claim anchored, the whole thing structured with the same architecture her mother had used for board presentations. Plain, unadorned, the kind of thing that didn't need decoration because the truth inside it was load-bearing enough. She did not speak to Declan. She did not speak to anyone from Blackridge. She did not tell her location to anyone outside this building. 3 days before the summit, Marcus Webb called with news that felt like a gift. The board had agreed, he said, to a preliminary negotiation meeting on the chairmanship question scheduled for the morning of the summit itself before the main proceedings. He'd arranged it personally. He sounded satisfied. The satisfaction in his voice was the satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully maneuvered her into the position that made his other client's victory inevitable. She thanked him warmly. She ended the call. She looked at Lucien across the table where they'd been reviewing the presentation, and she said, "They think I'm walking in to negotiate my own surrender." "Yes." "So they'll be relaxed as people like that get. Declan will have prepared a statement. Soren will have the board votes lined up. They'll expect a private meeting, an offer, a quiet capitulation." She turned back to the laptop. "They'll have the summit structured as a ratification, not a fight. Which means the room will be full of people who came expecting routine business," Lucien said. "Press included." "Press included." She saved the file. "How many of the board members are genuinely theirs?" 7 of 12. The other 5 are procedurally neutral. They vote with the majority in most contested situations because they have no stake in the conflict itself, only in stability. Meaning, if we turn the room publicly and fast enough, the neutral 5 follow the momentum. Yes. He paused. It's not guaranteed. Nothing is guaranteed. She closed the laptop. "Are you going to be there?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be in the building." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I'll be where I need to be." She let that be what it was. She had learned over these weeks that there were questions Lucien answered completely and questions he answered partially, and that the partial answers were not evasions but were themselves a kind of honesty, the honesty of someone who wouldn't make promises about things he couldn't predict. The night before the summit, she didn't sleep at all. She lay on her back in the facility room with her hands on her stomach, and she had a long internal conversation with her mother that consisted mostly of silence and a few questions she didn't expect answers to. She thought about what it meant to walk into a room where everyone had been told a story about who you were, and to offer them a different story. She thought about the specific courage that required, not the physical kind, not adrenaline courage, but the cold, sustained kind that had to survive a night of lying still in the dark. She got up at 5. She showered. She dressed in the suit that the gray uniform woman had produced without being asked. Dark navy, structured, the kind of thing her mother would have worn to a board meeting she intended to win. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. Her face looked like someone who had not slept and did not intend to let that matter. At 6:15, Lucian knocked. She opened the door and he stood there in a dark suit. Different from the coat, more architectural, the kind of clothing that was its own statement about what kind of room you intended to walk into. And he held out a folder. She took it. Inside, Dr. Patel's certified copy of the original DNA results, stamped and signed, with the treating physician's certification on letterhead. Beneath it, the restaurant photograph, the statistical brief, the transfer records. Everything in order, everything with a clean chain. She looked at him. She said, "If this doesn't work, it will work. But if it doesn't," he held her gaze. "Then we find another way." A pause. "But it's going to work." She nodded. She put the folder under her arm. They walked out. The Aldrich Conference Center occupied the top 3 floors of a building that Vail Dynamics owned, had always owned, had been built by her parents to host exactly this kind of gathering, the annual summit, the one that determined the company's direction, that brought together board members and major investors, and the press in a room designed to feel like importance was native to it. Seraphina had attended 11 of these summits, the first time at age 9 beside her father, the last time as chairwoman 18 months ago, before the marriage consumed her attention. She knew the room the way you knew a room that had always been yours. She arrived in the lobby at 8:47 a.m. Marcus Webb was waiting by the elevator bank. He saw her, and his face did something complicated. Surprise, recalibration, the specific micro-expression of someone finding the situation slightly different from what they'd prepared for. He said, "You look," and stopped. She said, "Let's go up, Marcus." In the elevator, she stood beside him and watched the floor numbers and breathed slowly and felt her body doing the thing it had been doing for 4 weeks, this physiological steadiness that she'd stopped trying to explain and had simply started using. The baby moved once, a slow push against her ribs. She put her hand on her stomach briefly. Marcus watched her do it and looked away. The pre-summit meeting was in the smaller conference room, the one off the main hall. Declan was already there. He was standing near the window with a glass of water and the expression of a man who had rehearsed his demeanor and was wearing it comfortably. Victor Soren sat at the conference table with 2 attorneys she didn't recognize, which told her he'd brought outside counsel for this, which told her how much he trusted Declan's in-house team to finalize this cleanly. Soren looked at her when she came in. He was older than she'd expected from photographs, late 60s, silver-haired, with the specific stillness of someone who had spent a career making large-scale decisions in small rooms. He nodded at her with the impersonal courtesy of someone acknowledging a transaction that was nearly complete. Declan said, "Seraphina." She said nothing to him. She sat down across from Soren's attorneys and she set the folder on the table and she put her hands flat on its surface and she said, "I'm not here to negotiate." Soren's expression shifted. Barely. "Mrs. Ashford, Vail," she said. "My name is Seraphina Vail." "Ms. Vail," the impersonal courtesy adjusting itself. "Your attorney indicated—" "My attorney," she said, "has been passing information to your operation for 4 months. Everything I told Marcus Webb, I told him knowing it would reach you." She looked at Marcus. He had gone very still in the way a person goes still when the floor has disappeared beneath them and they haven't started falling yet. "Everything he told me you were doing, I factored in accordingly?" Soren was watching her now, with different eyes. Declan had set down the water glass. She said, "The preliminary meeting doesn't matter. The negotiation doesn't happen. In 40 minutes, the summit begins. And I'm going to walk into that room, and I'm going to present the evidence of what you've built here. The forged DNA results, the laboratory breach, the wire transfers, the judicial arrangement with Reinhardt, the acquisition scheme through your shell entities, in front of every board member, every major investor, and every journalist who received an invitation to what they believe is a routine shareholders' proceedings." Soren said, "You don't have evidence that would—" "Dr. Anil Patel," she said, "the certified clinical record of my original DNA results showing a 99.97% probability of paternity. She touched the folder. The surveillance footage from Harwick Diagnostic Server Room showing Carl Weber's access. The wire transfer from your entity to Weber's personal account, 8 days before the presentation. The restaurant photograph of you and Judge Reinhardt, 11 weeks ago. The statistical brief documenting 7 cases in which Reinhardt's rulings benefited your network. She paused. Dr. Patel will testify in person. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the conference room's glass wall, she could see early arrivals moving through the main hall, board members, investors, 2 camera crews setting up in the back corners. Soren said, "This is a significant claim to make publicly without—" "I have everything I need," she said. "The question you should be asking yourself right now is not whether the evidence exists. You know it exists. You've known since Marcus told you about the surveillance footage." She watched him process that. The acknowledgement that she knew what he knew, the realization that the feed had been deliberate. The question is whether you want this to happen in public, on camera, in a room full of people whose investment portfolios will be affected by the next 2 hours, or whether you want to call your attorneys right now and begin a different kind of conversation. Soren looked at her for a long time. His face was doing very little. Seraphina had learned in the past 4 weeks to read the faces of men who kept their faces controlled. And what she read in his was not fear exactly. Men like Soren didn't process fear the way other people did. It went somewhere else. It became a different thing. What she read was calculation, the pure, unsentimentalized arithmetic of a man deciding which loss was the smaller one. He said, "What is it you want?" Full withdrawal of the acquisition position. All shares held through the shell entities sold at current market price, with proceeds held in escrow pending the federal investigation that is going to begin after today. Complete board restoration of my chairmanship. And Declan's public acknowledgement, on record, today, that the DNA report he presented was fraudulent. Declan said, "Sarah, don't," she said without looking at him. She kept her eyes on Soren. "Those are the terms. They don't negotiate." Soren looked at his attorneys. A look passed between them that was entirely a language she wasn't supposed to read. Then he looked back at her and said, "Give me 15 minutes. "You have 10, she said. "The summit starts at 9:30. She stood up. She picked up the folder. She walked out of the conference room into the main hall, and she stood beside a column near the entrance, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slowly, the way she'd learned to breathe through contractions, the way you breathed when what you needed was for your body to stay with you for just a little longer. Lucian appeared beside her. She didn't know where he'd been. He didn't explain. She said quietly, "Soren's calculating. He'll calculate that public exposure destroys everything he's built, not just this acquisition, his other positions, his network, his leverage." He paused. "Men like Soren protect the architecture above everything. If this building burns, every other building he owns burns with it. So he folds." Probably. "I don't do certainties," he said. She almost smiled. "I know." From inside the conference room, through the glass wall, she could see Soren talking to his attorneys with his hands flat on the table, the same posture she'd used, and she thought about the strange mirroring of it. She watched his face do the arithmetic. She watched Declan standing by the window again, separate from the conversation, which told her Soren had already made the determination that Declan was the expendable component of this structure. Declan didn't know that yet. He would. She looked at the main hall filling up, board members in good suits, investors with the particular alert quality of people who had been told this was routine and were beginning to suspect it wasn't, journalists with lanyards and recording equipment finding their positions in the back third of the room. She looked at the podium at the front where the chairperson stood to address the summit, which was her podium, which had been her mother's podium, which had never once belonged to anyone who had come at it through forgery and manipulation and the specific cruelty of using someone's pregnancy as a corporate instrument. She looked at her watch. 7 minutes. The conference room door opened. Soren's lead attorney came out first, which was the move of a man who was sending a buffer, which told her the calculation had not resolved cleanly. The attorney was a tall woman in gray who moved with efficient communicative precision, and she stopped in front of Seraphina and said, "Mr. Soren would like to discuss a modified arrangement that addresses—" "No modified arrangement," Seraphina said. "My terms. Complete." The attorney looked at her, not hostile, appraising, the look of one professional evaluating another's position. Then she said, "He'll need 24 hours to—" "He has 3 minutes," Seraphina said. "After that, I walk through those doors, and the summit proceeds as scheduled." The attorney went back inside. Lucienne was very still beside her. The hall was nearly full now. She could hear the low collective sound of a room settling, chairs, conversations tapering, the ambient shift that preceded a formal beginning. Dr. Patel was in the second row on the left side in a dark blazer with the folder of certified documents on her knee. She'd arrived at 9:15 without a word to anyone, found her seat, and sat with the particular composure of a woman who had decided something and was done deciding it. 2 minutes. Seraphina watched the conference room door. She watched Soren through the glass wall, sitting very still with his hands on the table and his attorneys on both sides of him and the arithmetic moving behind his eyes. And she thought about the night on the road, about the rain and the curb and the $40 and the 1% battery, and about the specific sequence of choices that led from that moment to this one, and whether any of it would have gone differently if she'd been a different kind of person. And she decided it wouldn't. And she decided that was not a comfortable truth, but it was the truest one she had. 1 minute. The conference room door opened. Soren walked out alone. He walked toward her with the measured pace of a man who had lost something and intended to control the manner of the loss. He stopped in front of her and he said, very quietly, "The shares will be withdrawn. I'll contact the board members before the session opens." He paused. "The Reinhardt matter I cannot—" "The Reinhardt matter," she said, equally quietly, "is not part of my terms. That's a federal matter. It proceeds independently of what you and I agree to here." She held his gaze. "We're not negotiating Reinhardt. He's already done." Soren looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a man who was seeing, for the first time, the full dimensions of what he'd miscalculated. Not her evidence. Her. The version of her he'd built his plan around, the isolated, abandoned, legally outmaneuvered woman, and the version of her standing in front of him now, and the distance between those two versions. He said nothing else. He walked back toward the elevator. His attorneys followed. He didn't look at Declan through the glass. Declan was still standing by the window when Seraphina walked back into the conference room. Marcus Webb had not moved from his chair. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who was doing the specific mathematics of his own exposure and not arriving at any comfortable sums. She looked at Marcus for a moment. She said, "I trusted you for 2 years." He said, "Seraphina, don't." She looked at him for another moment. Then she walked past him toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at Declan, and she said, "You have 10 minutes before I go out there. If you want to control any part of what happens next, you walk out with me and you tell the truth, on the record, in public." She paused. "If you don't, I present everything without your participation, and you have zero control over the framing." Declan's jaw moved. He said, "You're giving me a choice. I'm giving you the last one you'll get from me." She looked at him with the specific clarity that had been building for 4 weeks, for 14 months, for longer than she wanted to count. 10 minutes. She walked out into the hall. She walked through the main doors into the summit room. The room went quiet in that particular way it went quiet when someone walked in who the room had not expected. She walked to the front. She stood at the podium. She looked at the room. Board members, investors, journalists, cameras. And she looked at Dr. Patel in the second row who gave her a single nod. And she set the folder on the podium surface, and she opened it, and she put her hands flat on the first page, and she looked Part Nam. Hội kết của kịch bản điện ảnh này được triển khai với đồng lượng 3.000 đến 3.500 từ. Bắt đầu trực tiếp từ điểm kết thúc của Part 4. Yêu cầu bắt đầu bằng việc giải quyết triệt để đỉnh điểm cao trào từ phần trước. Cuộc đối đầu cuối cùng phải diễn ra khốc liệt và chân thực, nơi mỗi cái giá phải trả đều trở nên đắt đỏ và không có chiến thắng nào là dễ dàng. Hãy đảm bảo mỗi nút thắt, bí mật và mâu thuẫn từ Part 1 được phơi bày và xử lý trọn vẹn, standalone ending, không để lại bất kỳ chi tiết thua hay mở ra phần tiếp theo. Duy trì giống văn Mỹ thô ráp nhưng sâu lắng, tập trung vào sự biến đổi nội tâm của nhân vật sau cơn bão.
Hội thoại trong phần này cần mang sức nặng của sự trao đổi, cay đắng và chân thực, lồng ghép tinh tế những thông điệp về bản chất con người và ý chí sinh tồn thông qua hành động thay vì triết lý suông. Hãy kể theo ngôi thứ ba, triển khai chi tiết từng phân cảnh, scene by scene, với nhịp điệu chậm dần về cuối để tạo sự lắng động, tuyệt đối không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, tiêu đề phụ hay nhắc đến thực thể tôn giáo. Hãy trình bày trực tiếp trong tin nhắn, viết cực kỳ chi tiết từng ánh mắt, cử chỉ và hơi thở cuối cùng của câu chuyện. Nếu đặt giới hạn phản hồi, hãy dừng lại ở một câu rạng rỡ để tôi ra lệnh viết tiếp nhằm đảm bảo độ sâu sắc nhất cho kịch bản lồng tiếng 2 tiếng. Chỉ dẫn bắt buộc. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu nhằm mục đích giải trí, không dựa trên bất kỳ sự kiện hay nhân vật có thật nào. Show more 8:58. She looked at the room and the room looked back at her, and for 3 full seconds nobody moved. Then she began. My name is Seraphina Vale. My parents built this company from a research laboratory and 14 years of work that most people in this industry said couldn't be done. I've been chairwoman of this board for 22 months.
And 6 weeks ago, my husband stood in a ballroom and told 200 people that the child I'm carrying isn't his, using a document that was manufactured in a server room at 11:47 on a Tuesday night by a man who was paid $340,000 to do it. The room was completely still, the kind of still that required effort from the people in it. She opened the folder. She didn't look at her notes. She'd memorized this. I'm going to tell you what actually happened, and I'm going to show you documentation for every claim I make. Because the people who built this operation were careful. They were very careful. And the only way to dismantle something careful is to be more careful. She started with the DNA results. She laid out the clinical record first, Dr. Patel's certified copy, the stamp and signature visible on the projection screen where Lucien's man had connected her laptop without drawing attention to himself at any point in the previous 20 minutes. 99.97% probability. Treating physician certification. Clean chain from collection to processing to her patient file. Then the laboratory archive version, the one that had been shown in the ballroom, and the comparison between the two side by side, the markers that had been altered highlighted in a pale yellow that looked almost gentle against the technical language surrounding it. She said, Dr. Anil Patel processed my original results and is present in this room. She will answer questions from the board under oath if the board chooses to request that. She looked at the second row. Patel sat with her hands folded on the folder in her lap, and her eyes level, and her expression saying exactly what Seraphina needed it to say, which was, I am not afraid of any question you have. She moved to the surveillance footage, the grayscale figure in the server room. The badge paused at the readable frame. She did not editorialize. She stated the name, the timestamp, the duration of access. She stated that Carl Weber had died in a single-vehicle collision on the interstate 9 days after this footage was recorded. She said it plainly, without inflection, which was more devastating than anything she could have done with her voice. Then she laid out the financial structure. This part took 11 minutes. She walked through it methodically. The shell entities, the acquisition chain, the shares accumulating over 8 months, the wire from Soren's entity to Weber's personal account, the 3 tranches to Reinhardt's consultancy. She named every company. She named every account. She put the restaurant photograph on the screen, Soren and Reinhardt at a table 11 weeks ago, and she let the room look at it for a full 10 seconds before she moved on. She named Victor Soren. She named Judge Reinhardt. She named Marcus Webb. When she said Marcus's name, she heard a sound from the back of the room. Not words, just the collective exhale of journalists who recognized that they had stumbled into something that was going to require significant column inches. She saw 2 of them already typing. She saw a board member in the 3rd row lean toward the board member beside him and say something she couldn't hear, and the second board member did not look surprised, and that was interesting. She named Declan last. She said his name in the same tone she'd used for all the others. Level, factual, stripped of the 14 months that made it complicated. She said what he had done, and she showed the documentation for what he had done, and she said he had been offered the opportunity to address the room directly, and had not taken it. And then she stopped talking and looked at the main doors at the back of the hall. They opened. Declan walked in. He walked in alone, without attorneys, without the practiced composure he'd worn in the conference room, and he looked like a man who had spent 10 minutes in a small room with the full understanding of his own situation and had arrived on the other side of those 10 minutes changed in some cellular way that didn't show on the surface but changed the way he moved. He walked to the front of the room. Seraphina stepped back from the podium. He stood in front of it without gripping it, without the glass of water he would normally have had, without anything. He said, "The DNA report I presented at the Black Ridge investor reception was fraudulent. I knew it was fraudulent when I presented it. The original results, which I had access to, showed that I am the biological father of the child my wife is carrying." He stopped. He looked at the table surface in front of the nearest board member. "I participated in a plan to use that false report to remove Seraphina Vale from her position as chairwoman of this company. I allowed my marriage and my wife's pregnancy to be used as instruments of that plan." He stopped again. That's what happened. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. There was nothing in that direction worth spending her eyes on. He walked back out the way he'd come. The room erupted. Not shouting. It wasn't that kind of room. These were not people who shouted in professional settings. But the controlled cacophony of 40 people all trying to process simultaneously, board members talking to each other across the table, journalists standing and moving, someone's phone ringing and being silenced. The board chairman, a man named Gerald Holt, who had been in his seat for 14 years and had the particular exhausted competence of someone who had seen most things and was now seeing a new one, banged a gavel twice and said, "We'll take a 15-minute recess." And the room didn't exactly comply, but it shifted, which was the best a gavel was going to accomplish. Seraphina stood at the podium. She didn't move. She felt the baby move, a long, slow arc just below her ribs, the most patient movement, unhurried by everything happening outside. And she put her hand on her stomach and she breathed. Lucien was at the side wall. She found him in her peripheral vision, still and unobtrusive in a room full of movement. He caught her eye once. That was all. The 15 minutes were 45. During them, 2 board members came to speak with her directly. One of the 5 neutrals, a woman named Priya Okafor, who managed a sovereign wealth portfolio and who said simply, "The documentation is compelling. I intend to move for a formal board resolution of support for your chairmanship before the end of today's session," and then left without waiting for a response because it hadn't been a question. And one of Soren's 7, a man named Hector Villanueva, who had the look of someone who had believed he was buying into a manageable situation and had discovered otherwise, who said, "I'd like to understand the terms of the share withdrawal." And she told him to speak with her attorney, by which she meant the attorney she had retained that morning, not Marcus Webb, and he nodded and went away. 3 federal investigators arrived during the recess. They had been briefed. Lucien had seen to that. The specific briefing of specific agencies through specific channels she had not asked him to detail. And they moved through the room with the unhurried, unflappable quality of people who had warrants and time. One of them spoke briefly to Gerald Holt. Holt's face did something she'd never seen Gerald Holt's face do before, which was show an emotion without filtering it first. Then Holt came to her and said, "I don't believe we're going to be able to complete the scheduled summit agenda today." "No," she said, "but the chairmanship resolution can proceed separately. It doesn't require the full agenda." He looked at her for a moment. "You've had this planned?" "Yes." "Since when?" "Since I understood what the summit was actually going to be used for." She held his gaze. "Gerald, I've been in this building since I was 9 years old. I'm not going to let them have it." He nodded. He went back to his seat. He called the room to order with more authority than the gavel had managed, and he said, "Before we address the federal matter, this board will vote on a resolution. The resolution is as follows: to reaffirm Seraphina Vale's position as chairwoman of Vale Dynamics, and to formally rescind any proceedings initiated in the previous 40 days relating to board succession or chairmanship review." He looked at the table. "Those in favor?" 8 hands. Priya Okafor's was the first. Then the other 4 neutrals, reading the room with the practiced accuracy of people whose professional survival depended on reading rooms accurately. Then Hector Villanueva, whose hand went up slowly, like a man making a decision while the decision was being made. Then one more from Soren's 7, a woman who had barely spoken in any board meeting Seraphina had attended, whose name was Diana Chow, and who raised her hand with a clean, decisive motion that said she'd decided this some time ago. 8 in favor, Holt said. 6 against. The resolution carries. The 6 did not look at her. She did not look at them. She was looking at her hands on the podium, and she was thinking about nothing, which was its own kind of fullness. What followed was not dramatic in any cinematic sense. Drama required witnesses who were surprised, and by the time the federal investigators began their formal processing of the scene, everyone in the room had been surprised past the point where surprise was available. It was procedural. Documents were requested. People were asked to remain. 2 of the remaining Soren-aligned board members attempted to leave early and were politely redirected to seats near the investigators' table. Gerald Holt signed 4 authorizations in sequence, each one moving a different thread of the situation into a different jurisdictional lane. Victor Soren was arrested at the building's lobby exit at 11:23 a.m. She wasn't there to see it. She was in the smaller conference room with her new attorney and 2 investigators going through the documentation she'd brought, page by page, slowly, with the careful pace of people building something that was going to have to hold weight in a court. She was there for 3 hours. The baby moved intermittently. She drank 3 glasses of water that someone brought without being asked, and she ate half a sandwich from a tray that appeared at some point, and she answered every question completely and without decoration. Marcus Webb was picked up from his office that afternoon. She learned this from her attorney's message at 4:47 p.m. She read the message and set the phone down and sat with it for a while. She thought about the 2 years. She thought about the voice at 4:18 in the morning, Sarah, the relief in it, and she thought about how relief and guilt could live in the same sound if the person was skilled enough. And she thought about whether that skill was something you cultivated deliberately or whether it arrived through accumulated practice, and she didn't arrive at an answer and she stopped trying. She did not feel triumph about Marcus. She felt the specific, hollowed-out weight of someone who has been betrayed by a trust they should have been able to give. And the anger underneath it was real, but it was tired, the way anger gets tired when it's been running too long on too little. Declan was taken into federal custody at 6 p.m. She was in a car by then, being driven back to the facility for one final night before Dr. Farouk cleared her to move. Somewhere with a proper delivery suite and a medical team that didn't operate out of a room she'd never known the address of. She got the notification on her phone from a news alert, a photograph of him at a building entrance with 2 agents, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she looked out the window instead, at the city moving past in the early evening light, the particular gold of it, the way it fell on buildings that had no idea what had happened inside other buildings today and didn't need to. She turned the phone face down on the seat beside her. She thought about 14 months, about the version of herself that had walked into Blackridge Estate as Declan Ashford's wife, carrying the specific optimism of someone who had decided to believe in a person and had organized her life around that belief. She didn't hate that version of herself. She didn't think that version had been stupid or naive in any way that deserved punishment. She thought that version had been doing what people do, which is extend themselves toward what they love. And sometimes what they love is a structure built over a hollow place, and the only way to find out is to put your weight on it. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved against her palm. "I know," she said quietly, to no one, to the car, to the gold light on the buildings. "Me too." Lucien came to see her that evening. He knocked. He'd always knocked, she realized. From the first night in the room she'd woken up in, every entrance had been preceded by a knock or a visible pause at the threshold. She didn't know if that was manners or methodology, and she'd stopped trying to distinguish them. She said, "Come in." He came in. He was in a different suit, the third one she'd seen him in, and he looked like someone who had also had a long day, which she registered with something close to gratitude, because it was the most human she'd seen him look, the slight tiredness at the edges of him. He sat in the chair. He said, "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "Ask me something harder." "All right." He looked at her. "What do you need?" She thought about it. "To have her," she said. "Soon." She touched her stomach. "And then to go back to work." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The federal filing names the full structure. Soren's network, the shell entities, the acquisition chain, the Attorney General's office is moving quickly. I think they've had pieces of this building for a while, and your documentation gave them the keystone. He paused. It won't be clean. It will take time, but it's going. And Reinhardt filed for emergency leave from his judicial position 2 hours ago. The State Judicial Review Board is convening next week. He looked at the window. He'll be removed. She absorbed that. 7 cases in 4 years. 7 times a rigged outcome. She thought about all the people on the other side of those 7 cases who hadn't had Lucian Moretti's network or a certified physician's testimony or a restaurant photograph. She thought about that weight being different from tonight's tiredness, heavier and more permanent, and she decided to put it in a place she could return to when she had the capacity to do something with it. My parents' company is going to be fine, she said. It came out like a statement of something she was confirming rather than something she was predicting. Yes, Lucian said. It is. She looked at him. In the weeks of this, the weeks of being in his building, in his care, in the strange and bounded proximity of a situation neither of them had chosen. She had been building a picture of him from small, accumulated details. The tea at the right temperature, the knock before entering, the 47 pages delivered with enough trust in her capacity to absorb them without preparation. The way he'd said it's going to work with the specific conviction of someone who had decided it was true and was using that decision as a structural element. She said, "Why did my father trust you?" He looked at her, a long look. "Your father was the only person I did a significant amount of business with who never once tried to use what he knew about me as leverage," he said. "He simply worked with me, honestly. And when the business was done, it was done. No residue." He paused. "I haven't had many experiences like that." She thought about her father, about the particular integrity of him, the way it hadn't been performed or consciously maintained, but was simply structural, the way his bone structure was structural, just part of what he was built from. She said, "He would have liked this. Today." "Yes," Lucian said. "He would have." They were quiet together for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet, which was itself notable given everything that the quiet contained. She said, "After I leave here, after the delivery, after I go back to the company, I want to know what I owe you." He looked at her steadily. "You don't owe me anything." "That's not a real answer." "No," he said. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father did something for me once that I couldn't repay while he was alive. Consider this the repayment." He paused. "We're even." She looked at him. She understood that this was another partial answer, that there were things inside it that weren't being said. Probably things that were true and couldn't be said, and that this was simply the nature of this man, and that accepting it was part of what it meant to have come through something like this with someone like him. She said, "All right," and she meant it, not as a capitulation, but as an actual settlement, the kind that held. He stood. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. She said, "Are you going to disappear?" He stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was as close to unguarded as she'd seen from him, which wasn't very close, but was enough. "I don't disappear," he said. "I just don't make appearances." She almost smiled. She was too tired to complete it, but the beginning of it was real. That's a meaningful distinction. "I think so," he said. He left. The door closed with the quiet click of something well-made and properly fitted. She sat for a while. Then she got up and walked to the window and looked out at the city at night, at the lights of it, at the particular density of a city that had thrown her out into the rain and had been rearranged by the consequences of that decision without knowing it. She put one hand on the glass. The cold of it was specific and grounding, the way cold things were grounding when the rest of the world felt like it was still moving. Her daughter was born 11 days later. The delivery suite was on the 4th floor of a private hospital with a window that faced east, and it was 6:14 in the morning when it was over, and the first light was coming in sideways through the glass and laying itself across the floor in long, pale strips, and the sound her daughter made was the most ordinary, miraculous sound she had ever heard, the furious announcement of a person who had arrived and intended to be known. The nurse placed her in Seraphina's arms. She was very small. She had a quantity of dark hair that was unreasonable for a newborn, and a face that was angry with the indignity of the process. And Seraphina looked at her and felt something break open in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was in there, but something more structural, something that reorganized the load-bearing elements of her into a new configuration, one that could hold more weight than the previous version. She said very quietly, "Hello." The baby blinked. Her eyes were dark, unfocused, pointed in the approximate direction of her mother's voice. "I know," Seraphina said. "It's a lot. You'll get used to it." She didn't name her that day. She waited 3 days, which some of the nurses thought was unusual, and some thought was fine. And on the third morning, she held her in the east-facing window light and looked at the city from this distance where it couldn't touch either of them yet. And she said, "Nora." Her mother's name. The one that belonged to someone who had built something real and had passed it on with the specific generosity of people who build things for the people who come after them, not for themselves. Nora blinked. She seemed to find this acceptable. 6 weeks after the summit, the federal indictments were filed. Declan Ashford, fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, conspiracy to commit murder in connection with the traffic incident staged during Seraphina's first week at the facility. The charge she hadn't expected, but Lucian apparently had. He'd filed the relevant documentation with the investigators in the second week, before she'd even fully processed that the traffic incident had been directed at her specifically. Victor Sorin. 17 counts across 4 jurisdictions, including racketeering, judicial corruption, conspiracy, and securities fraud. Marcus Webb. Disbarred pending trial, 4 counts of conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty. She read the filings in her office at Vail Dynamics, at the desk that was hers, in the building that her parents had built, with Nora sleeping in a bassinet in the corner that her assistant had procured without being asked, because she had the kind of assistant who understood that some things didn't need to be asked for. She put the filings in a drawer. She closed it. She opened her laptop and she looked at the quarterly numbers, and she thought about what needed to happen in the next 90 days to stabilize the share price and what needed to happen in the next 18 months to rebuild the board into something that didn't have 7 compromised seats in it. And she began making notes. The city outside her window was doing what cities do, which is exist with absolute indifference to the specific dramas playing out inside the buildings that make them up. Somewhere in it, Lucien Moretti was not making appearances. Somewhere in it, the legal machinery was grinding through the consequences of a plan that had been built over 8 months and had taken 6 weeks to dismantle. Somewhere in it, a woman named Anil Patel was sitting in her laboratory doing clean science and would continue to do so. And that seemed like the right outcome for someone who had done the right thing at personal cost. Nora made a small sound from the bassinet. Not distress. The other kind. The sound of someone adjusting to being in the world. Seraphina looked at her. She looked at the city. She looked at the desk that was hers, and the numbers on the screen that were her responsibility, and the drawer that held the filings, and all the weight they represented. She thought about rain, about a curb and $40, and a cracked phone screen, and the specific moment before the headlights swept over her when she had not known that anything was coming. She thought about what came after the not knowing. She turned back to the screen. She picked up her pen. She began. She looked at the room and she did not flinch. That was the first thing, the not flinching. Because the room was looking back at her with the specific attention of people who had walked in expecting procedure and had found something else entirely. And there was a version of this moment where that attention became weight, became the kind of pressure that pushed air out of your lungs and made your hands uncertain on the podium surface. And she felt that version pulling at her edges, and she did not let it in. She said, "My name is Seraphina Vail." Not Mrs. Ashford, not the chairwoman, just the name she'd been born with, the name that was on the founding documents of this company in her mother's handwriting, the name that had existed before any of the rest of it and would exist after. My parents built Vail Dynamics over 14 years. They built it from a research concept that 3 separate investment groups told them was not commercially viable. And they were wrong, and my parents were right, and this company is the proof of that. She paused. She looked at the board table, at Gerald Holt, who was watching her with the particular careful attention of a man choosing what to do with what he was about to hear. I've been chairwoman for 22 months. In that time, this company has posted 4 consecutive quarters of growth and expanded its research division into 2 new verticals. I say this not to make a case for my performance, because my performance isn't what's on trial today. She put her hand flat on the folder. What's on trial today is whether the truth of what happened to me and to this company gets told in this room by the people who were present for it, or whether it gets managed, contained, filed somewhere that keeps it from being inconvenient. She opened the folder. I'm going to tell you what actually happened. I'm going to show you documentation for every claim I make. And when I'm finished, there are people in this room with authority to act on what I've shown them, and I'm asking them to use it. The presentation took 23 minutes. She had timed it in the facility, standing in the corridor at 5 in the morning with the laptop balanced on a supply cart, running through the sequence until the pacing was right. Not rushed, not labored, the specific rhythm of someone who had enough time to be thorough and enough respect for the room not to waste it. She showed the clinical record and the altered version in parallel. She showed the server room footage. She showed the wire transfer. She named Victor Soren with the transfer record on the screen behind her, and she watched 3 members of the board look at each other in a way that told her they were not entirely surprised, and she filed that observation away without letting it change her face. When she showed the photograph of Soren and Reinhardt, someone's chair moved. A small sound, the legs of it against the floor, the involuntary physical response of a body reacting before its owner could stop it. She didn't look to see whose chair. When she named Marcus Webb, a journalist in the back third of the room made a sound. Not quite a word, more like the leading edge of one. A bitten-off intake of breath that contained all the words that would follow in the next several hours and days. 2 others were already typing. One had a phone raised. She named Declan last. She said his name with the same flat precision she'd used for all the others. And she described what he had done, and she described what she had offered him. And she looked at the main doors at the back of the hall, and they opened. He walked in alone. He walked in the way a man walks when he has spent 10 minutes in a small room and has arrived at something he cannot leave the small room without doing, when the alternative to walking through a door is something he has looked at directly and found that he cannot be that. Not quite, not even now. He walked to the front with the same economy of movement he used for everything. Declan Ashford had always moved well. It was one of the first things she'd noticed about him, the physical confidence of a man who had never needed to take up space because space arranged itself for him. But the confidence was different now, stripped of its underlying assumption. And what was left was just a man walking towards something he deserved. He stood at the podium without gripping it. She stepped back and gave him the space, and she stood to the left of it, and she did not look away from him, because she had decided that she was not going to look away from any part of this, that looking away was the thing she had been trained into by 14 months of a marriage that required her to not see in order to function, and she was done with not seeing. He said, "The DNA report I presented at the Blackridge investor reception was fraudulent." His voice was level. She gave him that. She had expected something more defended, more hedged, some grammatical structure that put distance between the statement and the person making it, and instead he said it plainly, the way you said something when you had decided that the only remaining form of integrity available was to not qualify the thing. I knew it was fraudulent when I presented it. The original results, which I had access to, showed that I am the biological father of the child my wife is carrying. A pause. The briefest one. I participated in a plan to use that false report to remove Seraphina Vale from her position as chairwoman of this company. I allowed my marriage and my wife's pregnancy to be used as instruments of that plan. He stopped. He looked at the table surface in front of Gerald Holt, not at Holt. At the table. At the grain of the wood, or the nothing above it. At the specific middle distance of a man who has said the thing and now has to occupy the silence after it. "That's what happened," he said. He walked out. She watched him go. She watched the doors close behind him, and she stood in the front of the room with the folder under her arm, and she breathed, and the breath was slower than any of the breaths she'd taken in the previous 23 minutes, and it tasted like something she didn't have a word for. Not victory, not relief, something more complicated than either, something that had grief inside it along with everything else. Because you could not spend 14 months believing in a person without there being grief when the believing ended, regardless of what the person had done, regardless of how necessary the ending was. She had known this was coming. She had felt it arriving since the night on the road, and knowing hadn't made it simple, and that was true. And she was going to carry it being true. And she was not going to use that truth to soften what he'd done or complicate what needed to happen next. She turned back to the room. "I'd like to ask the board to vote," she said. Gerald Holt had been waiting for that. He picked up his gavel with the manner of a man who had finally found a use for it and called the room to order with more authority than he'd managed in the previous 23 minutes, and the room came to order. And he stated the resolution, and he called the vote. 8 hands. Priya Okafor's came up first, clean and immediate, no hesitation in it. Then the other neutral members, one by one, reading the room the way professionals read rooms, but also, she noticed this, the small additional motion in each of them, something else, something that was less calculation and more a response to what they'd seen and heard, the particular alignment that happened when evidence was clear enough and a person's sense of basic fairness was engaged at the level underneath professional judgment. Then Hector Villanueva, slowly, with the expression of a man settling a debt he hadn't planned to have. Then Diana Chow, decisive, final, 8-6. Holt said, "The resolution carries," and set the gavel down. The federal investigators moved in before the recess was formally called. She had known they were coming. Lucien had arranged the briefing. She hadn't asked how, she'd stopped asking how, for the subset of things where the answer lived in territory she couldn't follow him into, and she had made her peace with that limitation, with the fact that this entire outcome had required her to operate in proximity to methods she would not have sanctioned from a position of safety. She had not been in a position of safety. She had been on a road in the rain with 1% battery, and the moral geometry of that position was different from the geometry of a position where clean options existed, and she had made decisions accordingly, and she would live with them, and she thought she could. The investigators were professional and thorough and took no apparent pleasure in the procedural weight of what they were doing, which she respected. They spoke to Holt first, then to several board members, then to her, briefly, scheduling a formal session for the following day. 2 of Soren's remaining board members were asked to remain when the others were permitted to leave. They remained with the specific stillness of people who understood that compliance was the only form of control left to them. Victor Soren was arrested at the lobby exit at 11:23 a.m. She was in the smaller conference room when it happened, going through documentation with her new attorney, a woman named Claire Sato, who specialized in corporate fraud litigation and who had the particular quality of someone who loved the complexity of a large, well-documented case the way other people love difficult puzzles, and who had been retained 4 days before the summit through a channel that had nothing to do with Marcus Webb. She learned about Soren's arrest from an alert on her phone. She read it and set the phone down and picked up the next page of documentation and kept going. At 4:47 p.m., her phone showed a message from Claire. Webb picked up from his office. Cooperating. She looked at the word cooperating for a moment. She thought about what Marcus Webb would cooperate with, what information he would provide in exchange for whatever mitigation cooperation produced. And she thought about all the conversations she'd had with him in 2 years. And she thought about the 4:18 a.m. call and the sound of his voice, Sarah. And she thought about the specific human capacity for performing loyalty while practicing its opposite, and how long a person could sustain that before one of them eclipsed the other. She put the phone face down and kept going. Declan's custody came at 6 p.m. She was in the car by then, being driven back to the facility, and the notification came through a news alert the same as Soren's had. She looked at the photograph, him at a building entrance, 2 agents beside him, his coat the one he'd worn to the ballroom that night, the one she'd seen him select that morning while she was still pretending to believe the day would go differently. She looked at his face in the photograph, and she looked at his face in her memory, and she looked at the city outside the window, and she turned the phone face down on the seat beside her, and she watched the city instead. The city was indifferent, which was what she needed from it. Its lights were coming on in the early evening, building by building, floor by floor, the ordinary accumulation of people ending their days and beginning their evenings, and none of them knew what had happened in the Aldrich Conference Center today, and most of them never would. And that was fine. Truth didn't require audience to be true. This had happened. The documentation existed. The votes had been cast. It was done in the ways that mattered regardless of how many people knew about it. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved, slow and purposeful, the kind of movement that in the past 4 weeks had come to feel like a form of communication. Not language, something more elemental than that, just the physical fact of another person's existence making itself known, persistent, and uncomplicated. "I know," she said. Quietly, to the interior of the car, to the baby who couldn't hear her yet, or perhaps could, depending on what you believed about that. Almost. She stayed one more night at the facility. Dr. Farouk came in the morning and checked the monitors and told her everything was where it should be and that she was cleared to transfer to a proper delivery suite at her discretion, which meant immediately, which she did, because she was done with the facility and what it represented. Not ungratefully, she would never be ungrateful for it, but she was done with the chapter it belonged to, and she needed to begin the next one. Lucian came that last evening. He knocked, as he had always knocked, and she said, "Come in." And he came in, and he was in a different suit, and he looked like a man who had also had a long few days, which was the most human she had seen him look. A slight tiredness at the edges of him that his general economy of expression didn't quite conceal. He sat in the chair. His chair by now. She realized she was going to remember this chair, the specific angle of it relative to the monitor, the way he sat in it without using its back, upright, like a man who had long ago stopped needing furniture to support him. He said, "How are you?" "Tired," she said. "Ask me something harder." Something moved in him, not quite a smile, the precursor to one, the structural intent of it. "What do you need?" he said. She thought about it honestly. To have her, and then to go back to work. She looked at her hands. And to stop feeling like I'm waiting for the next thing to go wrong. "That takes longer," he said. "I know." She looked at him. "Does it stop?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which she appreciated because the alternative was reassurance. And she'd had enough of reassurance from people who weren't in a position to make it true. "It becomes background," he said finally, "instead of foreground. You learn to work with it there." She nodded. That was honest, and she could use it. She said, "The federal filing, the murder conspiracy charge, the traffic incident." "Yes." "You filed that documentation in the second week, before I knew that's what it was." "Yes." "You knew from the beginning." "I suspected from the pattern of it. The incident was too clean for coincidence and too early for panic. It was planned, which meant it was always part of the operation, not a reaction to anything you'd done." He paused. "I wanted to be certain before I told you. Telling you too early, before I could document it, would have given you information you couldn't act on and would have changed how you operated in ways that might have been visible." She held his gaze. "You managed what I knew." "I managed the timing of what you knew," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "There is. I didn't withhold the information to protect myself or to control the outcome in a way that benefited me. I withheld it until I could give it to you with the documentation that made it actionable." A pause. "You can disagree with that call." "I do," she said. "A little." She let that sit. "I also understand it." She looked at the window. "I don't know how to feel about how much I understand it." "That's a reasonable place to be." "It's an uncomfortable one." "Most reasonable places are." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father, the business arrangement you mentioned." He waited. "You don't have to tell me what it was." "I know," he said, "but I want to understand why you're here. The real reason, not the repayment framing. I believe that's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go all the way." He looked at her for a long time. The window was dark behind him, the city's light coming through it in that diffused ambient way that made everything in the room slightly softer than it actually was. And in that light he looked, not different exactly, but more legible, like a document you'd been reading in bad conditions finally moved under proper illumination. He said, "Your father helped me find someone once, someone I'd lost track of, through circumstances that weren't simple. He used his resources, his people, without asking what the circumstances were or what I intended to do afterward. He trusted that my reasons were sufficient. He stopped. They were. But that's not something I could prove to someone who didn't already believe it, and he believed it without requiring the proof. Another pause. I've spent a significant portion of my life in environments where people required proof of everything before they extended any trust at all. Your father didn't. It was unusual. She thought about her father, about the specific quality of his trust, which had not been naive. He had been a careful man, a precise man, a man who read situations accurately and often quickly, but which had been genuinely extended, not strategically deployed. He'd trusted because he'd decided to, not because he'd verified sufficiently. She had inherited that tendency, and it had cost her, and she had also inherited his ability to recalibrate without abandoning it entirely, which was the harder part of the inheritance and the more valuable one. She said, "He found her, the person you were looking for." "Yes." "Is she's well," Lucien said. The two words were the most unguarded thing he'd said in the entire time she'd known him, and she recognized them as such and didn't press, because there were things that belonged to people that didn't become available just because a crisis had created proximity, and respecting that was its own form of honesty. She said, "Then we're even, like you said." He nodded. "And after I leave here, if I needed—" She stopped, reconsidered the sentence. "If Nora ever needed?" He looked at her. "Then you call," he said. Simply, without performance, the way you said something when it was just true and didn't need supporting architecture. She nodded. She looked at her hands. She said, "Thank you for the road, for all of it." He stood. He picked up his coat. He said, "Your father would have found a way to manage without me." A pause. "But I'm glad you didn't have to." He left. The door closed. The room was quiet in the specific way it was quiet when a presence had departed, and what remained was the shape of it, the impression left in the air. She sat for a long time. Then she got up and walked to the window, and she looked at the city at night, at the density and the light and the movement of it, all those lives proceeding in parallel, all that in different momentum. And she put her hand on the cold glass, and she felt the cold move through her palm, and she thought about nothing for a while, which was its own kind of rest, the first real rest she'd had in 6 weeks. Her daughter was born 11 days later at 6:14 in the morning. The room was east-facing, and the light came in sideways and pale and particular, the specific quality of early light that doesn't announce itself, that just arrives and does what it does to surfaces. The sound her daughter made was the most ordinary, miraculous sound she had ever been in the presence of. The furious, uncomplicated announcement of a person who had arrived and was registering their arrival with complete conviction and no interest in whether the timing was convenient. The nurse placed her in Seraphina's arms. She was very small, unreasonable amounts of dark hair, a face that was working through a sequence of emotions with the intensity and rapidity of someone processing an enormous amount of new information simultaneously, which, Seraphina supposed, was exactly what was happening. She looked at her daughter, and she felt something break open in her chest. Not dramatically, not the way things broke in films, but the way things broke that were meant to break open, that had been built to contain something until the right moment, and then to release it. And this was the right moment. And what released was not simple and was not one thing and had no name that covered all of it. She said, very quietly, "Hello." Her daughter's eyes were dark and unfocused and oriented in the approximate direction of her mother's voice with the instinctive accuracy of a creature who had been listening to that voice for 8 months and recognized it as the primary fact of her world. Seraphina held her, and the morning light lay across both of them, and she said, "I know, it's a lot. You'll get used to it." A pause. "We both will." She named her on the 3rd day. She waited because she wanted to be sure, not about the name. She'd been sure about the name for 3 weeks, since the night in the facility when she'd been awake at 2 in the morning and had thought about her mother and the boardroom nod and the inheritance that couldn't be forged. But about the moment. She wanted to give the name in a moment that was quiet and specific, not in the middle of paperwork or visiting staff or the procedural business of early days. She wanted to give it in the morning light, which was where she'd found everything that mattered in this story. She held Nora in the east-facing window on the third morning, and she said the name once, quietly, and then again, and the baby did the thing babies did, which was exist with complete wholeness regardless of what you called them, and Seraphina looked at her daughter and at the city beyond the glass, and at the morning pressing through it, and she understood that this was the shape of what she'd come through. Not the summit, not the vote, not the arrests and the filings and the evidence chains, but this window. This name, this small person in her arms who had been used as a weapon before she was even born, and who was here anyway, indifferent to all of it, requiring only the ordinary things. The federal indictments were filed 6 weeks later. 17 counts for Soren across 4 jurisdictions. The number for Declan was smaller, but the charges were more personal. Fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and the murder conspiracy count related to the traffic incident, which the federal filing described in 3 precise paragraphs that she read once and did not read again. Marcus Webb's disbarment was processed concurrent with his criminal filing. Judge Reinhardt resigned before the State Review Board completed its process, which was the move of a man who had calculated that resignation produced a smaller permanent record than removal. And she thought about the 7 cases and the people in them, and she thought about what she was going to do about that. Not now, but eventually. And she put it in the place where the things she was going to do eventually lived, which by now was a substantial place. She read the filings at her desk at Vail Dynamics, the desk that was hers, the building that was hers, in the sense that it belonged to what her parents had built, and she was the custodian of that, and she had fought for it, and it was still standing, and so was she. Nora was in a bassinet in the corner of the office. Her assistant had arranged this without being asked, because she had the kind of assistant who understood that some things didn't need to be asked for. Nora was asleep with the totality that infants slept, fully committed, the way she committed to all her states. Seraphina put the indictments in a drawer. She closed it. She opened her laptop. She looked at the quarterly numbers and the board reconstruction schedule and the 2 new board members she'd already identified as replacements for the vacated seats, and she thought about the next 90 days and the 18 months after that, and the decade her parents had spent building what she was now responsible for continuing. And she began making notes. The city outside her window was doing what cities did. The morning was doing what mornings did. Nora breathed in the corner with the steady, uncomplicated regularity of someone who had decided that existence was acceptable and was proceeding accordingly. Seraphina looked at the screen. She looked at her notes. She looked at the drawer with the filings in it, and she thought about the rain, about the curb and the wet stone and the darkness of the road and the strange, specific mercy of headlights appearing when she had stopped expecting them. She thought about everything that had lived between that moment and this one, every choice, every cost, every version of herself that the situation had required her to become, some of which she would keep and some of which she would put down carefully, now that she could, now that putting things down was an available option. She thought about what her mother would have said. She thought her mother would not have said anything. Her mother had been a woman who expressed most things through action, through the nod across a boardroom, through the building of things that lasted. She would have looked at this office, and at the bassinet in the corner, and at the numbers on the screen, and she would have nodded, the same nod, the one that meant, "You are here. You belong here. Now work." Seraphina looked at the screen. She picked up her pen. The morning came through the window the way morning came through windows, which was without drama and without apology, which was the only way anything worth having ever arrived. She began.